Headline: As evidence shows Kyle Rittenhouse acted in self defense, don't forget the Gospel Coalition called him a mass shooter. Now, this has interesting implications for those of you that maybe haven't been following the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. He's basically a young man who, in the midst of a BLM Antifa riot, was armed and attacked and shot some people and was accused of murder and those kind of things, charged with those crimes, and now is facing trial for them. And as the trial is moving along and evidence comes out, it is pretty clear that that's not how it went down. In fact, the one of the gentlemen who Kyle Rittenhouse shot, because I believe, if I remember correctly, he two people died, one person lost his arm. This is the gentleman that lost his arm, was on the stand today, on the stand at the trial, and admitted that Rittenhouse did not fire his weapon until the other man had been pointing a gun at him, which is pretty much a textbook's definition of self-defense. Certainly, with as heated as things were and the speed of the action, the Rittenhouse defense team is certainly very happy about that. You can see the prosecutor with his head in his hands, just lamenting because that no pun intended blew a hole in his case, in his prosecution of Kyle Rittenhouse. And but if we rewind the clock, we have supposedly Christian gospel institutions prejudging the situation, declaring guilt before any trial commenced, certainly not looking at Kyle Rittenhouse as being innocent until proven guilty. And probably the biggest duck in the puddle was the Gospel Coalition. Now, what makes this interesting, at least to me, is we've discussed in recent days and last week some of the implications of Christians dealing with handling their sins against each other and whatnot in the civil arena, in the secular courts. Scripture teaches believers to handle those things within the church and not take them to the secular courts. For instance, Mike Stone, Georgia's Mike Stone, suing Russell Moore for defamation, and a lot of Christians saying, well, he shouldn't do that because Christians are supposed to keep it in the church. My basic argument is, well, Russell Moore isn't a Christian, so those verses don't apply. But it'll be very interesting. I don't know if Kyle Rittenhouse if he considers himself a Christian or not. If we would accept him as such, depending on what he would confess. But it presents a very interesting question. If Kyle Rittenhouse and his team decides to turn around and sue for defamation, media outlets like the Gospel Coalition, who called him a mass shooter prior to any real evidence being presented in trial, if he's acquitted, could they turn around like the Covington Catholic kids and sue for defamation? The Covington kid, Nick something or other, I forgot, but he basically sued CNN and the Washington Post and a bunch of other media outlets for defamation, for saying things about him that were false before any evidence came out of what happened between himself and the Native American banging the drum in his face last year or the year before, or whenever that was. But he was successful. He sued CNN. He sued the Washington Post. He got a judgment in his favor. Probably part of that judgment was not revealing exactly how much that was. But this seems like a potentially parallel situation here, as Kyle Rittenhouse can very well turn this same accusation against the Gospel Coalition for defaming him, calling him a mass shooter prior to anything going down. It reminds us of when Beth Moore and some other formerly SBC loudmouths were getting on Twitter and ripping the Covington kids before any evidence came out. She still hasn't apologized for that because she's a prideful, evil woman. But those kids could have rightly turned around and sued her for the same thing. So it'll be curious to see if Kyle Rittenhouse, upon acquittal, which I would argue is likely at this point, if he turns around and sues outlets like the Gospel Coalition. The concern for us as discerning believers is this is a purported Christian organization that has clearly sinned against this young man, clearly prejudged him, clearly not taken any of the facts into account, not given him what is a right under our system of being innocent until proven guilty. They just came out, came right out and called him a mass shooter before anything had happened, comparing him to Dylan Roof, who was a mass shooter, convicted in court as a mass shooter. So this is I'll dig into this just a little bit. So this was a quote from a Gospel Coalition article entitled "Why I Hate August" from Edward Copeland at the Gospel Coalition. I'm going to click on this to see if they've put it down. Apparently, they haven't pulled it down. So this article here from the Gospel Coalition of August of last year, this gentleman K. Edward Copeland talking about why he hates August and still haunt. He goes into some things. He says right here, this August, however, is the hurt is amplified by an egregious contrast. Kyle Rittenhouse killed people in the middle of the street on camera in front of witnesses, then smoking rifle at his side, casually strolled past law enforcement. He didn't run away, he didn't hide, showed no fear. Gets into it. And then right here says, when armed mass shooters like Kyle Rittenhouse and Dylan Roof, who by the way was a school shooter, convicted school shooter, who did kill a bunch of people in not in self-defense, but certainly murdered them. So he refers to Kyle Rittenhouse here as a mass shooter. A lot of us took issue with that at the time because we saw the footage, we knew what was described, and yet a trial hadn't even commenced. There was no evidence that had been adjudicated in the system. So this is something that we're going to follow and find out what happened. But the summation of this basically is we have once again the Gospel Coalition very willingly and happily taking the position and the framework of the secular media and versus the God-given rights that are part of the jurisdiction of the United States. How we do our legal system and what we believe comes from being a human being created in God's image. You're innocent until proven guilty because we believe that every human being has that intrinsic value as a creation of God. It'll be very curious to see how this happens going forward, but suffice to say, it is yet another black mark against the Gospel Coalition, or as we sometimes like to call them, the Social Gospel Coalition.